Hi, Whiskey Ringers. I hope you're all well and enjoying the podcast. As always, I welcome any thoughts, suggestions, and feedback you have to make the podcast better, and, of course, any suggestions you have for guests you'd like to see. I wanted to share with you a new way to participate in the Whiskey Ring Podcast Bottle Share Club. There are several people who have reached out to me about being put on a waiting list for the top tier. After much thought, I've decided to open that tier up to more people. If you have been hesitating, or if you are a current supporter wanting to level up, reach out to me at david@whiskyinmyweddingring.com or through social media or Patreon, and I'll be happy to help you move up. I also wanted to send a special thanks to my current $25 a month patrons, who have agreed not only to this change, but who have been truly irreplaceable supporters of this and who make this podcast happen. Thank you to all of you in no particular order. I'm talking to you, Ken, Jesse, Jim, Bill, Don, and John, Yana, Connor, Zach, Scott, Ollie, Steve, and Jake. Without your support, this podcast wouldn't be happening anymore. And thank you for helping me to keep the lights on and keep guests coming to you every week. As always, you could support the podcast for as little as $1 a month, with ad-free episodes starting at $5 a month. This support is the reason the lights stay on, and to make sure the podcast and website are the best they can be. Thank you to all who are already patrons, and I hope to have more listeners join soon. Visit patreon.com/whiskyinmyweddingring to join today. Without further ado, here's a new episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. Hey folks, welcome to a new episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. Today we're going back over to the west coast of Scotland, which I've been realizing that I've been loving over the last couple of years, just getting to know the area, and I hope to visit there soon. And we're talking to a very special distillery there. It's a newer one of the new crop. Also a connection to Jim Swan, who's been coming up recently in our podcasts. And more than anything, I think they are the distillery leading the pack, specifically in Scotland, on sustainability and having that as a core focus and pillar of their identity. So with that, I'd love to welcome on Annabel Thomas, who is the founder of Nc'nean Distillery. Welcome on.
Thank you so much for having me, David.
Absolutely. I'm thrilled to have you on. And just as a quick shout out before we get started too, shout out to my friends Kurt Maitland and Charlie Prince, who hosted Nc'nean on the same night, unfortunately. But so I didn't get to meet Annabelle in New York City, but I met Sasha, who also works with Nc'nean. So we had a great time, and I've been really looking forward to this interview since then. So glad to have us connect. So I wanted to just start off with, as we normally do with these, where did things start? The origin story for Nc'nean.
So where did it start? I always say really it came from two things. The first is the location. So Nc'nean is on my family's farm, right up on the west coast of Scotland. We're in a super remote location, and you can't really be on the west coast and not think about whiskey. It was actually originally my dad's idea. We have this beautiful old, what's called a farmsteading or a farm building, a traditional U-shaped farm building just next to our house on the farm, which kind of wasn't really suitable for modern day farming anymore. And my dad had this idea of, we could put a whiskey distillery in there. That was probably back in 2010. And we didn't get very much further than that, but it was the kind of thing that we talked about around the dinner table. And wouldn't it be cool to have a whiskey distillery? And at the time, I was a strategy consultant. So I worked for Bain & Co., which is a big, originally American consulting firm. I was based in London and doing projects for, FTSE 100 type listed companies. And I knew I didn't want to do that for my whole career. So I had been looking at other jobs, which did not, by the way, at that point include starting a whiskey distillery. And but what I knew is that whatever I did next wouldn't let me take these amazing sabbaticals that Bain were very good at letting you take. So I decided in 2012, like autumn of 2012, to take my last sabbatical. And I did some traveling and some fun stuff, but I also said to my family, look, why don't I write a business plan for this distillery? Because we keep talking about it and we're never going to do anything about it. Someone doesn't make a move. So I dedicated some of my time off to doing lots of research on this idea. And that took me through building some Excel models. It took me deep into the land of biomass boilers, but it also took me on a trip to Islay because I wanted to visit lots of distilleries in a kind of similar location or an easy location and really get a feel for what they were about. And it was at that point, I think, that the idea really became something I felt very passionately about. And the reason that happened is twofold. One is that I actually started to like whiskey. Now, this was not a peated Islay whiskey that I tried, but it was the whiskey I tried before leaving home to go on this trip. So that was really important. And the second thing was that I felt that having been around the distilleries, they were all very traditional. They were all saying we're doing things the way they've always been done, which is, I don't think, a bad thing. A lot of the history and brilliance of Scotch is based on that long tradition. But I felt like surely there's a need for distilleries to kind of look forward and be more innovative and experimental, but also to focus on sustainability, because not a single distillery mentioned fossil fuels, climate change, sustainability, you name it. No one seemed to care. And it doesn't take a genius to stand by a still and work out how much energy a distillery uses. So that was really important. So I wrote an outline business plan, which was very much focused on sustainability and innovation. But then I had to go back to Bain because that was the deal. I went back in November 2012, I think. And fast forward 6 months, my dad and I had been trying to push this project along kind of on the sides of our desks whilst holding down full-time jobs, and it just wasn't going to happen. We missed a major deadline in May 2013. And we thought, you know what, we're kind of wasting our weekends trying to do this and failing at the same time. So either someone's got to focus on this full time or we should just give up. And I hadn't really found any other jobs I wanted to do. Everything that I had looked at had kind of turned out to be a bit of a disappointment in one way or another. And I thought, hey, when am I going to get the chance to start a whiskey distillery again? So I kind of jumped without thinking that much more about it. I did it, I think, quite naively. Possibly that's a requirement to start a distillery. If you did it knowing everything, you might be too scared to do it. And yes, I started working on it kind of full-time mid-2013. Took us a couple of years to raise the money. It took us a couple of years to build it. And we started distilling in 2017.
There is something to be said about it. I don't think anyone listening to this podcast at this point, which I think, and I'm going to take the time to check on this because I'm very curious. Okay. So I think you'll be episode 148 if timing continues. So we'll quite be 150, but basically over 150 plus episodes, including bonus stuff. One of the most consistent things I've heard from people who have started distilleries is if we knew what we knew now about getting into it and starting one, we would never have done it. And so I think, and I should say, I think the earpods might be blocking out the laughter, but Annabelle is laughing hysterically right now for listeners. So I think
what
nobody
I really
listening
want
to my
know,
podcast anymore will ever start a distillery.
Exactly. Well, I've got two questions off the back of that. Why surely people who are starting distilleries need to listen to your podcast more because there's still a lot being started. And the second is, I wonder if that is more common in distilling or whether everyone who starts businesses feels that.
It's a good question. There's barriers to entry, and I think in any business, of course, but distilling faces some uniquely high ones, both cost and infrastructure and everything that goes into it. Specifically for whiskey too. Even then it's easier if you're just doing gin and vodka and RTDs.
Totally.
But once you add in aged spirits, a whole other ballgame. So it's a good question though. I'd be curious to know. And the other thing that came up was you mentioned that in your original plan, working in 2012 and into 2013, your original plan had biomass boilers already in there. So sustainability was part of this from being before the beginning, shall we say? What I guess what piqued your interest in having that be a pillar of this future project?
Well, I was very personally interested in sustainability and I really valued it. But I'd also spent some time working for a British smoothie brand, which sounds weird, a place to take inspiration for whiskey from. But I had. And they were the kind of first, what I would describe as purpose-led business that I had ever worked for. So it was the first time I'd seen profit really combined with doing something good in the world, because most of the Bain clients were FTSE 100. They were just about the price on the stock market, and I'd done a lot of work for charities. But Innocent, this smoothie company, was the first time I'd seen those two things together, and that had convinced me that sustainability could be an integral part of a business's mission whilst also trying to make profit. And I found that very inspiring. And I think since I'd worked for them, I had just assumed that any good business did that. Certainly anyone that I was going to lead would do that. I think it's fairly unjustifiable, honestly, to start a business in this day and age, knowing what we know about climate change, and not take that into account. I also think, though, our location on the west coast of Scotland is very inspiring. It is really beautiful. It is really remote. And it's got some of the most untouched woodlands in Scotland, which are very unusual. If you've been to Scotland, you'll have noticed that most of the hills don't have trees on them. So for all of those reasons, it felt like a very important thing to integrate into the business. And it was also something that I specifically felt was lacking in Scotch. And I think it was putting really those two things together that made me think I have to do this. Because I think if every other distillery in Scotch had already been doing a fantastic job on sustainability, I might not have felt so motivated to try and change it. But I felt that if we could come in and do things in what I consider to be the right way, we might hopefully inspire the rest of the Scotch industry to move faster towards the end goal.
It's worth noting, as you said, that the west coast of Scotland is particularly verdant with its tree cover, where a lot of Scotland is not, either by nature in places like Islay or Orkney versus windswept islands where trees can't grow, or in the Highlands where the clearances took out the trees for over the centuries to build ships and buildings and whatever else you needed, and they weren't replanted because no one really thought about that at the time, at least not in the area, I should say. They thought about it in areas that the English cared about, and not so much where they didn't care about it. So the second part of that, or another part of the orange story I wanted to pull out there, was you said that you weren't really a whiskey drinker before exploring this. And usually people who start a whiskey distillery, they've, the typical guy story of, yeah, me and my bros, we've been drinking for 20 years together. And we're like, we should start a bar. We should have a distillery. And obviously this wasn't the case for you. So I think for me, there's a perhaps a missing link between, yes, you and your dad, and this maybe been your dad's idea of originally starting a distillery, of building this, and then you're building out this business plan. But wait, you weren't really into whiskey at the time. So did you start drinking whiskey as part of this business plan coming together, or was it just before that?
No, I'd always been really interested in whiskey, and I'd always tried whiskey when someone else was drinking it. I was really curious about it. My husband drinks whiskey regularly, and whenever he had some, I'd try it. And most of the time, I just really didn't like it. Until this one that I tried before we went to Islay, which obviously now I can't remember what it was because I didn't know it was going to be a significant part of my future at that point. So I didn't really pay any attention. But what I did do is put him on the insurance for the car hire so that I could also try the whiskies as we were going around Islay. And then, when I left Bain to start Nc'nean, I sort of didn't necessarily think I'd end up running it, for reasons that I can't really remember now. And so I just evolved into it. I'd always been curious about it. And I think on reflection, what I didn't like about it was that it was 46% plus neat alcohol. And what Scotch is like about how you mustn't drink whiskey. I had never had the confidence to try it in any other way or suggest to someone I might add water or anything else. And so I just ruled it out as something I didn't like. I think, and I think women, I think at least in this country, this might not be the case in the States, but in this country, men are kind of expected to like whiskey, and so just make themselves get over that hurdle of being able to drink neat spirits, whereas women don't really have that pressure, so we just don't get over that hurdle as early, and it took me until I was in my early 30s to get there. And now I love it. I love cask strength whiskey. I love whiskey with soda over ice. I can kind of do the full range. But one of the things that I think I bring philosophically to Nc'nean is this experience of not having like whiskey. And one of the things I'm very passionate about is trying to open whiskey up and break down some of those barriers that in particular Scotch has managed to put up around the industry, which I just think is very unhelpful and very exclusive and elitist, and I'm not a big fan of.
It's fair to think about that. The first thing that came to my mind is has now left it. But let's see if we can get that back. The first thing that came to my mind was that, in a way too, there's another benefit that I can think of, and we can explore this a little bit. Is one of my questions was going to be, did you have a profile in mind or a spirit character that you wanted to create and build this brand off of back in 2012, 2013? And most of the time, if I ask that question, it's because the person has been in whiskey or been drinking whiskey for a while, knows what they like. And so they can figure it out kind of generally from that matrix. But for you, as someone who really had tried stuff, hadn't necessarily enjoyed it, let's say, certainly not neat, I'll still ask the question, did you have something in mind?
In 2012, no, because in 2012, in my mind, I was just writing a business plan. But my mid 2013, when this was actually, we're going to do this, like 2012 was more like, could we do it rather than what are we going to do? But by mid 2013, it was like, this is going to happen. And by then, I had become quite clear on what I wanted it to taste like. I tried a lot of whiskies by then. That's a tough part of the research. And we'd honed it a lot more. Obviously, that further developed as we went, and we designed the stills and tried more whiskies and so on. But the kind of idea of a very light, fruity, delicious whiskey was quite clear by the time I left Bain to work on it full time in my mind.
So I did want to ask this. So you have this business plan that you've put together, and in 2013, it's become realized. You incorporate, and then comes the hard part of starting to build and figure out how you're going to do that. So this may be jumping forward a little bit, but as we mentioned in the intro, Nc'nean is a Jim Swan associated distillery. And I'm particularly curious, again, given your lack of connection, let's say, to the whiskey circles at that time, how you got connected with Dr. Jim Swan.
Well, that is a very interesting question. And luckily, I can actually answer that, because until about 2 weeks ago, I had forgotten. Partly because we met Jim Swan, I think, in early 2012. So this was like pre me even writing a business plan. And this is a funny story because in the UK, there is a charity called Drinkaware. And Drinkaware was set up by the industry to promote responsible drinking. And my dad was brought in to Drinkaware as the independent chair. So, and it was actually while he was doing this Drinkaware role that he had the idea for the distillery. And partly that was because he was seeing craft gin and craft beer and things through this role he had at Drinkaware. And through this role he had at Drinkaware, he got in contact with someone who, I can't remember who it was, at the Scotch Whisky Association. I think actually had a meeting with them, although I wasn't in it. And that meeting produced the connection to Jim Swan. So we were actually working with Jim Swan even as early as 2012 when I had taken my sabbatical and was writing the business plan.
Okay, so he was really would have had input from the beginning or before.
Absolutely. And I think we felt that was essential because neither of us have any distilling background, and we've always been super focused on making a really, really high quality product. And it felt like that was where we had to start. If we couldn't convince ourselves we can make a good product, then what was the point in even trying? So he was a pretty essential early piece of the jigsaw.
And we'll talk a little bit more about Jim in terms of the product itself. Of course, there are several of his legacies that live on in the whiskey, both the light floral fruity character of it, use of SDR casks, so a couple of and a clear word. I mean, the fewer tales in there, a couple of different things all lend themselves to his legacy. But before we go there, I want to touch on the site itself. So this is on your family's farm, west coast of Scotland. As you said, it's a somewhat difficult place to get to. We've talked to a couple of distilleries on this podcast that, even specifically in Scotland, that are kind of difficult to get to. Ardnamurchan comes to mind as one kind of similar, where I remember they had to get a special lorry to bring one of the products, I think the barley, in, because the road itself was not wide enough to get a regular truck in there. So
they also had problems getting there still over a bridge or something, I seem to remember.
Yes. Yeah, that might be what I'm thinking of too. Where you'd usually have like a wide load trailer or something to bring this equipment over, and they just could not get that over, so they had to figure something out. But you're in this fairly remote, beautiful place, overlooking the Irish Sea. Is it called the Irish Sea on the Scottish side, by the way?
Well, good question. Yes, I think it is, but actually we look at the Sound of Mull, because there's a body of water between us and the Isle of Mull, and then you get to the Irish Sea beyond the Sound of Mull. So we think of ourselves as looking at Mull, not the Irish Sea.
God, okay, sneaky on that one. Okay, that works. It works for me. So you're facing the Isle of Mull to the west, so you're getting plenty of that beautiful Atlantic maritime character, not as harshly, let's say, as the west coast of Ireland might, but you're getting plenty of there. So I'd love to know just more about the area and what it looks like and what the terroir and climate are like there.
Yes. So we're about halfway up the west coast. So if you were in Fort William, which is where Ben Nevis is, and you went directly west, roughly speaking, you would get to us. To actually get to us, you drive, say you're coming from Glasgow, you drive north from Glasgow for 2.5 hours. And just before you get to Fort William, you cross over this little ferry called the Corran Ferry, which is beautiful. You don't need to book either, which makes it easier. And then off you go, kind of driving out west. For the first 10 minutes or so, it's a double track road. And then you turn left onto single track roads. And that's the last of the double track roads you will see until you come back again. And you wind through the hills on this single track road. Some people take a wrong turning if they've got their Google Maps set wrong. And they end up going down this really, really narrow, extremely wiggly, sometimes unjustifiably wiggly road below these beautiful cliffs where there's wild goats. And then you pop back out onto the road where you should have been. And on you carry. You get then to Lochcarlin, which is a small town. It's got about 300 people in. There's a ferry that runs from there to Mull. There's an amazing restaurant. There's a petrol station, a shop, a cafe, a club, a hotel, a bunkhouse, and some Airbnbs, and that's about it. A school and a doctor's, importantly. And at that point, you turn north. So you're on Morven, which is a peninsula now, and you drive north up the sea. It's a really beautiful drive. The whole peninsula is not particularly mountainous. It's hilly, as most of the Highlands are, but it's not got these huge mountains. But as I said earlier, it's super wooded, and it's kind of bounteous from a kind of natural capital point of view. So it's got what's known as the Atlantic rainforest, which is this original, old, beautiful, very natural collection of trees. And The air is incredibly clean. It's got amazing wild animals. So we've got one of the best wildcat populations in Scotland. We've just had red squirrels reintroduced. We've got loads of eagles and buzzards and niche lichen and all sorts of other interesting things on the peninsula. And so you drive up this beautiful coastline for about 25 minutes on an increasingly narrow road until you basically get to the end of the road in a village called Bonneville or Nc'nean, which has about 50 houses. So we've got to an even smaller population. And then you drive onto my parents' farm, which is now a track, and you drive for another about a mile, and finally you get to the distillery. At which point you're a little bit above sea level and overlooking the Sound of Mull, and you can see Tobermory on the Isle of Mull opposite.
So you really, like you said, it's not quite the Highlands in the sense that you are very much at sea level or close to sea level. So not mountainous region at all. So these are all characteristics that lend themselves to more of that maritime influence. Now, I'll say up front, I don't necessarily find a ton of maritime influence in the whiskeys themselves. However, the gin, very much so. And I do love some maritime influence in there. The last question I just thought of on the origin story is, and correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm picking this up out of nowhere, but your accent sounds more East Anglian.
Oh,
if I had to.
It's true. Well, I don't know if it's specifically East Anglian, but it's definitely not Scottish. I grew up in Essex, just out, which is northeast of London, and I now still and always have since I left university lived in London. So, yes, I am. I sound 0% Scottish. From a blood point of view, I am a little bit Scottish. Unclear whether it's 5 or 20%, but somewhere in that region. But I feel very connected to Scotland. My parents have always had a place up there, and as a kid, I was dragged to Scotland against my will 3 times a year, and now I go voluntarily once a month.
That was East Anglia was one of the regions I studied when I was that recovering medievalist. So I was like, I'm pretty sure that's what I'm hearing, but
I love it.
No, that makes a lot of sense. That answers to the question of the Scottish connection. I don't think you need to be Scottish to start a distillery in Scotland. That's certainly not what I'm saying. But I like finding the origin stories. So getting into the history of the distillery and the products too, the name, Nc'nean.
The name. So it kind of in keeping with wanting to do things a little bit differently in Scotch. I didn't want to just call the whiskey the name of the place. And I wanted it to represent what we stood for more philosophically than just being about the place. Although the place is really important, and part of what we're trying to do philosophically with the distillery is create employment and industry in a place where there is not so much employment and industry. But I wanted the name to refer to something bigger. And so we looked back in Scottish history, and we found this amazing goddess called Nc'nean. So she was a pagan goddess, so from pre-Christian times, and she was known as the Queen of Spirits, although in that sense, spirits like nymphs and little woodland creatures rather than spirits like the whiskey we know it today. But she was also known as a protector of nature and for walking her own path. And we thought that so perfectly symbolized everything that we stood for, that we wanted to adopt her to kind of, showcase everything that we were about. The other nice thing about Nc'nean is that Nish, or Nook as it's become in our name, is the female equivalent of Mook. So Mook Donald means son of Donald as a Scottish surname, and Nook means daughter of, although not many people know that because it's not used to pass down surnames. Mm-hmm. And so I just loved this story, and I thought, this is perfect. This is who we need. But unfortunately, Nc'nean is about 13 letters long, and I didn't fancy typing it 100 times a day or having whiskey consumers around the world try to pronounce it. Now, I'm told Nc'nean is hard enough, but I can assure you that Nc'nean is much harder. so we shortened it to Nc'nean, and the little apostrophe after the C is meant to symbolize all the letters that we've taken out of the original name.
Gotcha. Yes, it's I mean it's a beautiful name when said out loud, for sure. Having just done an episode with Dingle Distillery in Ireland, I can commiserate with the fact sometimes these Gaelic words you look at and you're like, I have no idea where to even start with this thing. So plus you have a label to think about. As I said, it's not just the name of the distillery, but also the labels you're going to put on the bottles, and sometimes they do charge still by the letter. So
exactly, more to the point, I've got my emails to type to think about as well, and the thought of typing Nc'nean would be too much. So
you need one of those the good type of autocorrect that you start a word and it just, you just type NC apostrophe and it fills in the rest for you. But no, I can, but response emails would be difficult. I can tell you that.
Yes, exactly.
In getting to the production, I do want to be very upfront. I've listened recently as part of the research for this episode to an episode you did with Joshua Hatton over at One Nation Under Whiskey. And this was also done right after the New York City tastings. So he asked a lot of the really good production questions that I would normally ask. So I'm not necessarily going to ask the same ones. I'm going to try to break it up a little bit. So I would definitely encourage people to listen to that episode if there's anything that I missed here. With that said, one of the hallmarks, of course, of not only the sustainability is this organic nature and the organic barley that you're using. And an angle I thought was a little interesting was that Jim Swan is remembered for moving a lot of things forward, starting new cask types, new distilleries all around the world that were very reflective of their areas. But there was something that came up that you told to Joshua that in some ways showed that classic Scottish feeling, I guess, of this is how things have been done, and it's all that. So he said that Jim thought organic barley would be an expensive waste of time, that organic barley was poorer quality, not in the sense that the individual grains weren't great, but that you'd get different grain sizes, thus inconsistencies in the grist, inconsistencies in the mash, and it goes all the way through. For me, it was not quite jarring, I think, but it was definitely interesting to hear that perspective from someone who looked forward on so many things. And I'm curious, not to ask you to speak for him, but from your time with him, do you think that 10 years on now, he would hold the same opinion?
I don't, because I think were he still alive, he would have seen us use organic and it would have changed his views. I think I never got to really press him on that because we basically decided we wanted to do it in spite of his best advice. And we kind of agreed to differ. And we sort of agreed that once we actually started producing with this expensive waste of time, we would see what happened. But of course, sadly, he died just before we started producing. And so we never had that conversation. I think he had bad experiences with bad organic grain. I never got to find out where that was from or in what context, and whether that was poor malting or just poor quality crop in the first place. But Jim actually introduced us to our original maltster, who was very experienced with organic barley, and we never had any of those issues. However, he was right in that it's more expensive. I certainly would not have changed his mind on the price, because that was an absolute truth. But the waste of time, I think, we would have easily convinced them it wasn't a waste of time because our yields are exactly what he expected them to be. And of all the things we've had trouble with in the distillery, the organic barley is actually not one of them. But what I would really have loved to see is whether his mind was changed on the output and whether he actually could appreciate the flavour it brought or not. But sadly, we will just have to imagine that conversation rather than it being a reality.
True. Yeah, there are not many distilleries that have sustainability as such a focus, nor using organic barley as such a focus, and we're not just talking in Scotland, I'm talking worldwide. So it is still pretty niche to be doing this. But you said in that interview with Joshua that your yield is basically the same. It's 400-ish liters for every ton of barley, which is about what you'd expect from regular barley, regular being, non-organic or just commercial barley. Yes, more expensive per ton, but the price aside, it's about equal outputs. Given those changes, given those changes, I mean, he was right too, in the sense that you'll have different grain sizes, or you'll have, even if they're consistent across a batch, it might be smaller grains, less plump grains than a commercial barley. Did you have to adjust any of the processes that he had put into place, or any of the equipment to handle that type of barley?
No, we didn't. And I'm not sure even that the grain size is smaller, although now you're making me want to go and check. I mean, we use a completely, on the milling side, which is where it really makes a difference, this sort of conceptual idea of unequal grains. We use a completely standard mill, and we use completely standard ratios. So I am going to go and find some conventional barley and compare the grain sizes, but looking at it, it looks even the same. I think the grain sizes look the same. It behaves in exactly the same way in the distillery. We mill it in exactly the same way, and we mash it in exactly the same way. So we have made not a single adjustment for the fact it's organic, apart from having need more money to buy it. That's it.
I mean, it's a pretty cool thing to be able to prove, though, because I know we keep saying, price aside, that's the one thing you really can't change for now until it's, you get organic growth at scale. But
anyway, even at scale, I actually don't think that is the issue. The issue is that you get a lot fewer grains per acre of land than you do with conventional farming. Now, we could go down a whole rabbit hole of whether conventional farming at the yields it is getting is sustainable, and perhaps it's not. So actually maybe conventional farming comes down to the yields of organic farming, but that is the kind of underlying reason it's more expensive, because the farmer is getting fewer tons off his acre.
Right. So in that case, going back in the process before you're even getting the barley to the farmer who's growing that barley, were you able to find a farmer who was already growing organic barley, or did you have to find a farmer who was nearby who could convince them to grow it for you?
No, interestingly, once I had decided that I wanted Nc'nean to be organic, because that wasn't the kind of first step in the decision processes, we set out looking for the source, and there were quite a few blocks to begin with people saying no, 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 no. And then Jim Swan introduced us to Muntons, who were our first maltster, who said, sure, yeah, that's fine. Because it wasn't only organic that I wanted 100% Scottish, which was another layer of complexity. If I'd been willing to bring barley from England, for example, it would have been easier. But Munton says, yep, we have relationships with 10 Scottish farmers. We buy their grain every year. We mix it together in a big tank vat, and we'll malt it for you, and we'll send it over 20 tons at a time or whatever. So they were completely unfazed by it, but they were the only maltster that I spoke to who were completely unfazed by it. Since then, interestingly, other maltsters have both understood the value of small distilleries as part of their kind of portfolio, and also started to be able to deal with organic. So we've actually since moved from Muntons to Beds, partly because they're much closer to the distillery, so that's far fewer miles of haulage from a carbon footprint point of view, but also because they are able to malt single farms. And we wanted to reduce the number of farms we were buying from. So we had 10 farms all mixed together when we were with Muntons, but we now are down to basically just 2 with Beds, and having that relationship with individual farmers really allows us to work with them more closely to understand their carbon footprint, to understand their sustainability initiatives, and hopefully work towards a kind of even more sustainable version of the farming they're already doing.
And we keep bringing up the sustainability aspect of this as well. And there's very thorough sustainability report on the Nc'nean website, which of course will be linked in the show notes of this episode, just like social media and all of that. And it's worth a read because it does show not only what the original plan was, but shows, I think, for 2022 into 2023, what you had been able to achieve. And it was, to me, striking not only that at the distillery, you were able to have not only net zero carbon emission, but also such low emissions to begin with, or emission equivalents to begin with. And then when you put that next to the rest of the supply chain, the glass, the hauling, the growth, the farmers, everything else that comes before getting to the distillery and after the distillery, when, I mean, we're talking about something like 18 or 19 tons of CO2 versus 2,400 something plus tons of CO2 on the supply chain side. So it's a night and day scenario.
It is, although it is worth noting that in the year of the most recent sustainability report, we also built a warehouse and a bottling building, which is very carbon intensive. So some of that 2,400 is, or in fact, most of the 2,400 is the building. Without that, it's 300 or so. But still, it's still huge. It's still 80 to 300. So it makes our own emissions on our own site are negligible. It's all about the supply chain, and that's exactly where this initiative to move to beds has come from, because that's what we're now trying to address.
And perhaps I'm conflating two terms that may mean different things. So I'll ask this just to clarify. When you're speaking about organic farming and organic barley, how different, if at all, is it from biodynamic farming?
Very good question. It is different, although there is some overlap, both practically and philosophically. So biodynamic farming comes from a specific way of farming that was written down, I want to say early 1900s, but I might be wrong by that.
I think it was about 24, I want to say. Yeah.
1924.
Yeah, there was,
okay,
I'd ask
perfect.
just because we've talked to Waterford, so that he came, that guy came, exactly. I can't remember his name, but that guy came up. Yeah.
Steiner, Rudolf
yes.
Steiner.
Yes.
So Steiner wanted to collect all of the old ways of farming that he rightly felt were being lost. So, and he kind of combined all of these methods into a compendium of how to farm, some of which are entirely logical and some of which seem a bit crazy. Now, even some of the crazy things probably have really good origins or rationales, although that's not necessarily how they seem to the modern eye. And some of them are just very obvious, like planting and harvesting by the moon, because the moon really extracts the large gravitational pull on the Earth. And so that's what biodynamic is about. Organic is more like a reductive version of conventional farming. So it looks more at what you can't do compared to conventional farming. And in summary, that is no pesticides and no fertilizers. Now that it has in common with biodynamic, because obviously in 1924, they weren't using pesticides or fertilizers either. And so the two very much have that in common. The other thing that the two have in common is therefore a need to use alternative methods to substitute for those things, or one could say original methods. So for example, you will find most organic and biodynamic farms farm on a rotational system and have to have animals involved. In the rest of the UK, on conventional farms, if they're growing wheat or barley, you're very unlikely to ever see a cow on those fields. But on the biodynamic or an organic farm, the animals have to be fully integrated into the process. So in some way, in those ways, the two are very similar, but organic doesn't have the kind of planting by the phases of the moon or the cow horn mixtures that you dig into the side of the field, or stirring things in a bucket the right way around. I find biodynamics totally fascinating. I would love to distill some biodynamic barley. When I talked to Muntons about this at the beginning, they said, "What is biodynamic barley?" So that didn't fill me full of confidence that we're going to make it happen. And there are currently no biodynamic barley farmers in Scotland. So if I wanted to source biodynamic, I would need to go to England. And we decided that our principles of sourcing within Scotland were more important than my fascination with biodynamic. So for the moment, we only distill organic.
Enough. I don't know how many farmers, particularly in Scotland, we have listening to this podcast. I hope we can get a few on the whole.
Exactly. If you're listening, get in contact,
yes,
because I'd love to distill your barley.
And I'm curious then to just to clarify even further. So when you're asking a farmer to, maybe not, that's not the right way to phrase it. When a farmer is already producing organic barley, they're doing that reductive method. They're taking away the pesticides, the fertilizers, things that are not 100% necessary, and are replacing them with naturally occurring or other organic things. How is there a point or a threshold of, to put it for lack of a better word, organicness that you require from your farming partners?
Yes. And it is very simple. It must meet the UK and EU and global organic standards. So that is not regulated by us. That is regulated by the British government, which in turn developed those standards when we're part of the EU with the EU. So they're pretty well defined. They are regulated by the government, and then they're enforced by these, I think in the UK, there are 6 certifying bodies. So it all becomes a kind of chain of certification. So actually, we don't inspect our organic farmers. We rely on their certifying bodies to do the inspection, and they send us the certificate every year and so on. And that has to be the same for all parts of the supply chain. So, for example, the maltsters also have to source the farmer's organic certificate, and then they have to also be certified themselves, and so on and so forth. Which means that all UK organic farmers are working to the same standards. So consumers can feel confident that an organic grain of barley from one farm is as organic as the grain of barley from the next farm.
Gotcha. All right, makes sense. So you've got the farmers, you've got the malting, you've got the grain at the distillery. Now comes time to mash and ferment. And again, Joshua went through many of these steps, so I'm just going to kind of ask a couple of questions, dig further. But one of them was that initially used a cloudy wort and one yeast. Now you're using a clear wort and then 2 yeasts, Anchor and Fermentus, I believe, that are pitched at different temperatures depending on which one works best at those temperatures. So what led to that change in production style?
Well, it wasn't actually a change. It's just that we run 2 recipes and we run them different times in the year. But the confusion will have come from the fact that the cloudy wort 1 yeast we call the old recipe. But we mean old not in the sense we used to make it, but old in the sense it's going to become an old whiskey in the future.
Okay.
And then the clear wort 2 yeast high cut point recipe we call the new recipe, or the young recipe would be a better word for it. So it makes a great young whiskey. And the reason we run those 2 recipes, the young recipe, so that's the mash sits for a while. We have a very clear wort. We use 2 yeasts, and we have very high cut points. That is the kind of Jim Swan creation for a great young whiskey. And when I sat down with him in his last visit to the distillery, which was not yet operational before he died, he said, "This is going to make a great young whiskey." And I said, "But what if we want an old whiskey as well?" And he was like, "Oh, well, he wouldn't make it like that." And I said, "Okay, well, what would you do?" And we talked through what would become our so-called old recipe. And I thought, right, well, I think we want both. I think part of the kind of spirit philosophy of the distillery is that we want to create a range of flavors in the spirit rather than do what's traditional in Scotland, which is create one flavor, which I find a little boring, I wanted to create a range of flavors and thought, well, let's dedicate 10% of our production to this spirit that will make a great old whiskey and see nearer the time what we do with it. We had sort of by accident really started making that old recipe in the summer. And then Roger from Box Distillery in Sweden came, and we were talking to him about the recipes, and it happened to be summer and it happened to be warm. And he said, oh, it's very clever that you make the old recipe in summer because your cooling water won't be as cold, and so you're not capturing all the high fruity notes in the young recipe. And we thought, that is clever of us. It wasn't intentional, but now you've pointed it out, we're always going to make it in the summer. So it's also become this kind of summer recipe that we do when our cooling pond is maybe not at its optimal coldest, but it doesn't matter so much.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes a lot more sense now, because I was hearing old recipe, and like you said, I knew you were still doing it. So is it? Well, yeah, okay.
What I should call it is the long maturation recipe, but I've just been calling it old for 7 years, and I can't get it out of my mind now.
I mean, like there were Jack Daniels says old number 7. There were probably old number 6 and 5 before, so it was old at some point. So that does make me ask then, and actually there's a tie in with Jack Daniels on that. During the tastings, we got to try, I believe we tried 4 expressions. We tried the ex-bourbon cask.
Yep.
The connection being those are mostly former Jack Daniels barrels, or Brown Forman.
Yep.
You know? The red wine cask, primarily Rioja and STR.
Yep.
An Oloroso cask.
Yep.
And then the Quiet Rebels Gordon release.
Yes. And hopefully you also tried our flagship Nc'nean Organic.
Oh, I'm sure we must have. I'm sure I must just not have that typed in my notes. But oh yeah, I do. What am I saying? Yes, it is. Yeah, so 5. So the single malt for me, finally, reading my notes, because I can do that now. That was the single malt. Actually, funny story was that was the one where I was really confused about the not having any rims or legs, and we figured out it was because of the glass. So listeners, side tangent for a second, because that's worth telling. Normally when I do a review, I look at the color, but I also look at the rims, the legs, the drops. What does it look like in the glass? Because that's inevitably part of the experience. You're looking at it and experience, and you have an expectation when you see something in the glass. And I was looking at this in a Glencairn, and the liquid, no matter how much I swirled or sipped, just all pooled down to the bottom pool. No rims, no legs, no nothing. And it was a quick pull too. It was almost like it was being gravitationally forced downwards. And it was weird because I've tasted over 3,000 things at this point, and I'm like, I've never remembered seeing this before. So after the formal part of the tasting, I have Sasha come over, and I'm like, look, this is the nerdiest question you're probably going to be asked tonight, but I'm looking at this glass and you're seeing what I'm seeing here. And she saw the same thing. So, and Kurt saw it too. Like, it wasn't just me. And she's like, I'm going to ask Matt about this. So it turns out there was something about how the glass was washed where it didn't affect the flavor. Like there was no soapiness in there or, chemicals in there that I could tell, but it must have been something that coated the glass on the inside enough so that the liquid was not holding on to the sides of the Glencairn. So that led to a funny exchange via email, and that's where that story came from. But
it caused so much confusion on our WhatsApp group. Sasha asked the kind of
I bet
team WhatsApp, and we're like, no, we've got no idea what you're talking about, Sasha.
Yeah. And that was why I had her come over and see it too, because I didn't want to just describe it and her go back to Scotland and be like, this crazy guy in New York was seeing this thing, and, so anyway, so we start with that pour, and it was so fruity. I mean, I have notes of juicy fruit, gum if it was made with real fruits, lemon curd, peach ring candies, and that's these very light fruity notes. We said earlier that Jim Swan specialty. He loved those lighter notes, and that goes even to what you were saying about the recipes and the cut points, whereas his recipe would have been very little feints and tails, because he wanted the lighter ones and not the fusel heavier alcohols and oils. Um, there was a reason I was going there though. So with those different recipes in production of the products out there now, is it fair to assume then that what we're seeing really is the not the old recipe, the younger
Exactly.
recipe?
We have released not a single drop of the old or long maturation recipe yet. That will all be at 10 plus years. Although Matt did taste a barrel accidentally the other day of old recipe and said it was delicious. So we're all quite excited about that coming out. But yeah, we always said we keep it for at least 10 years. And so everything that has come out so far has been that young recipe, the short maturation recipe, the one that's designed for short maturation, or our yeast trials, which are they're I guess, part of the broader umbrella of shorter maturation, because we still have those high cut points, but with varied yeasts.
Right, so that's kind of the third. It's not quite fair to call it the third recipe because the recipe and things change in there with the yeast and such, but we'll call it the third recipe just for ease of keeping track. So in this third space, and you've got the two recipes already that are fitting to holes on the board, let's say. Why still go for that third one where you're still playing around with different yeasts and such? Is it just that natural urge for exploration and such?
Yeah, curiosity, fun, a kind of feeling that whiskey in Scotland has become more of a monoculture than an interesting culture. I drink a lot of beer, and the craft beer movement in the UK, as it is in the US, is really strong, and there's a lot of focus on yeasts. And I couldn't figure out why, when we're effectively beer makers that happen to distill our product, no one seemed to care about this. I think the fact that we're also producing whiskey now that is great at a young age makes that even more important, because frankly, if you're going to leave whiskey in a barrel for 20 years, the yeast is less important. But if it's not going to be in the barrel for so long, the yeast is super important. And I felt like it was just a really underappreciated facet of whiskey making. And I wanted, both for my own curiosity to explore it, but also to, I guess, bring it to wider attention as something that's important in whiskey making, something that a lot of people don't even realize is part of the process.
Especially in Scotch. And it will elaborate on a point that you made earlier, that for a long time now, century plus, if not longer, Scotch has been very focused on yield, and the flavor, in theory at least, the flavor is mostly going to come from the casks. You age it for 10 to 12 years, if not longer. That's why you see so many of these, the older generation, their core expressions 10, 12, 16, 18 years, etc., and all using basic distillers yeast, the same barley, all that. And then you get the individual flavors based on the sense of place, who's making it, the cut points and things like that. But the core of it, the pre-distillation point of it, is all pretty, as I said, monoculture. And
monoculture,
really,
and also optimized for efficiency, right? Short fermentations, no one's leaving the mash to rest, etc.
Right. And you get so many fun flavors when you do a long fermentation. You get the malolactic fermentation going in there. If you're using two yeasts, you've got even more complexity in there. So, and I think I know maybe one distiller, I don't think they're Scottish, but they're using 3 or 4 yeasts in there, kind of like you are, with different pitch points and temperatures and such. One pitched when the first one is completely done, so they have two full yeast fermentations before they get into malolactic. I would love to, if I could remember which one it was off the top of my head, but I'm sure it'll come to me. For the experiments that you've done so far, have you found any that you can tell us that have been particularly either interesting or you think will be successful?
Well, we first of all do the trials in a bucket, and so there are lots that are unsuccessful and never get beyond a bucket. But there is generally 1 or 2 a year that we think are successful enough in a bucket level that we do at a kind of full distillery level for a couple of weeks. And lots of them have been great, honestly. None of them have been a total disaster. Some of them have been great. Some of them have been spectacular. Some of the ones that we're most excited about are the beer yeasts, and we've only started doing them more recently. So we can taste them as new make and then taste them as the barrels evolve, but they're not yet at full maturity, but I'm pretty excited about them. We've done a collaboration with a small kind of independent bottling company on a specific Swedish farmhouse yeast that they were really interested in. We've got all sorts in the warehouse, and that's a really fun part of what we do. It's also great for the distillation team who aren't just doing the same thing day in, day out. Their year varies.
For those experimental batches then that you want to take further and you want to see how they age, to I guess in order to reduce the variables, are you then putting them all into the same types of casks?
Yeah, we are. Except, we don't bother putting them into sherries because we put them just into ex-bourbon and STR so that we can have a pretty close 1-for-1 match across the two if we wanted to. But we'll also compare new makes, and then we can also compare just 2 bourbon barrels side by side. Although, as we all know, even bourbon barrels themselves can vary quite a lot. So you can never perfect, unless you're just trying the new make side by side, you can never perfect that comparison.
Sure. It's a scientist in me. It's like, how many variables can we control on this thing? And whiskey is wonderful in that way.
Exactly.
There was one more part of the process that jumped out at me from both the research and Joshua's interview that I wanted to have you talk a little bit more about here too, which was you do a very slow distillation, basically as slow as possible. You said, trying to remember the exact words, was basically as slow as possible so that you're just getting liquid into the spirit safes, into the bowls. If you went any slower, there wouldn't be enough thermodynamic force to get over the hump. And part of that was that you wanted to keep the spirit safe below 20 degrees Celsius. And that was to keep the volatiles, the most volatile compounds, the flavor compounds, in condensate rather than letting them become gaseous again. I don't know if other distilleries have explored this or are doing the same thing, but that was the first time I had heard of it. So I was curious to hear how that evolved as part of the process for you.
That was actually both the slow distillation and the 20 degree point, which are both related and separate, are both Jim Swan isms, as it were. So he was very clear on both of those things. Very slow distillation and sub 20 degrees. He was so passionate about the sub 20 degree point that because we use a natural cooling method of our cooling pond, which we kind of can't regulate, we actually installed these electrical heat exchangers in case we needed to ever add extra cooling to the cooling pond, which we of course have never done. That was a total waste of money. But anyway, we put them there. But he was so focused on that as a sign of quality, because if you're going for this light and fruity spirit with these high cut points, you then lose half of the lighter alcohols you get through earlier in the rum because your spirit safe is too hot. Then it's all a bit of a waste of time. The slow distillation, though, is also to encourage lots of copper contact, which again in turn helps produce that light and fruity spirit. So it's not just about what happens in the spirit safe, it's also about what happens in the still before it's even come over the line arm.
And then the still shapes in themselves, what does that look like?
They are lantern shaped, so I'm kind of gesticulating here, which is absolutely no good for your listeners. But they've got a normal still shape at the bottom, and then they kind of have a narrow waist, and then they go out again above the waist, and then they go up. And they're sort of not very tall, not very short, but that kind of narrow waist and then coming out again really encourages more copper contact. So that's also, as well as the slow distillation, designed for the same effect.
Gotcha. So with that, I will move into the last section that I have for you, which is about the reception of the whiskey. So the first place to look is the local reception. And this is for the whiskey and for the distillery itself. We've already mentioned it's not the easiest place to get to. You can get there. There are it's not in the middle of the woods necessarily, but you can get there. And you mentioned that you have a lot of people nearby. You want it to be an economic driver for the region, drive employment, and that's also mentioned in the sustainability report as something that you're quite proud of. So, since you incorporated, let's say, the last 10 years or so, how has the reception been locally to having a distillery in the area?
Well, I would say it's been a bit of a journey, which I think is completely understandable. I think to begin with, people thought we were either mad, which of course we were, or sort of didn't believe it would happen, and were very concerned about the impact on the road because it is so narrow. And obviously, we have to bring in malt, we have to bring in bottles, we have to bring in barrels. But I think as things have evolved, and we also got through the difficult build phase, which obviously from a road point of view, as we were discussing with Nc'nean earlier, is very tricky in these regions. Right. It has been amazing to see how much people have embraced it, and it's fantastic. And I feel that now, I hope that people are very proud of the fact they've got a distillery on the Morvan Peninsula. And so I guess for them especially, that became the case once we had products out there, the Botanical Spirit, which we launched in 2018, and then the whiskey in 2020. And I often now get local people saying, "Oh, I was in Copenhagen airport and I saw Nc'nean, and that made me so proud," which I think is awesome. So as they've seen Nc'nean spread, they have something that brings it back to Morvan for them, which is awesome. But also, now that we are bottling whiskey, that has increased the number of jobs that we have. We've got more visitors coming, which again increases the number of jobs, and that's allowed us to really make that local employment piece happen, which I know people locally also really appreciate. So I think now it's really super positive, and we're also now able to support the community monetarily now that we've actually got some revenue, which of course doesn't happen for the first 7 years of a whiskey distillery. Which I think is all helpful. So now I feel like it's a really virtuous circle. We're growing. I feel like we're in proportion to our local place. We're not too big, and hopefully we're making a very positive contribution to the economy and the area.
And you mentioned earlier that you recently, in the last couple of years, built a new bottling facility, new building to address some growth that you wanted for the distillery. And I know as the plan would go, I know you don't want to get, as you said, too big, too fast. There are other constraints as well that you would be facing. So, in terms of growth, how I know Joshua asked the question as in like, what do you see in the next 5 years? What I'm going to ask instead is, how do you envision your growth plan going?
Well, whiskey is always one of those funny things, isn't it? Completely different to other businesses where you actually have to plan the growth quite far ahead because you need the stock and you need the right age of stock and so on. So we have a kind of steady growth planned until we are bottling everything we make, which is about 300,000 bottles. So we want to grow 20 to 40% a year over the next, let's say, 5 to 8 years until we're bottling everything we make. We may, along that road, decide to slightly increase production again, which we've already done once, or we may not. We'll just see how things go. But I have so from that point of view, I have a fairly clear idea of what we want to sell, and that involves gradually aging the product as well, introducing things like the long maturation recipe to market, but also keeping within the boundaries of what I feel is a reasonable size for the area that we're in.
Makes sense. Fair enough. And the second area of reception is the overall consumer. Now, having tasted the whiskey, I did really enjoy all of the ones that I tasted. I think, as I'm finding more and more, oddly enough, with many of the newer distilleries, that I like the core single malt the most of any of their expressions. I think all the ones I tasted I enjoyed, but I think that was the most representative of the character of the distillery. and then you can thus see it in other finishes and expressions. So when looking at a consumer, the first question I have is, have consumers connected with a sustainability focus?
Definitely, yes, but not everybody. But that's okay. I don't mind if some people don't like what we're doing, as long as enough people love what we're doing. That's what we're aiming for. And there are enough people out there who really care passionately about sustainability. That really love what we're doing. So that's great.
And then have there been markets as you've grown, and this can be domestic or international, markets where they've been more receptive and ones where you face challenges?
Definitely. And every market is actually different. And there are some where the consumer has been very receptive, but the reasons differ between markets. Some regions will focus more on one aspect of what we do, and some regions will focus more on other aspects, which is interesting in itself. And then there are other markets where either now or kind of more recently or in a longer term pattern, Nc'nean just isn't suitable. So, for example, Spain, very large country within Europe, very, very low premium single malt consumption. So we are not even present in Spain. Ireland being another good example, they have a lot of Irish whiskey. So there just is not that much interest in bringing Scotch into Ireland. So again, you can't buy Nc'nean in Ireland. But in contrast, in Germany, I would say they are the market that is most focused on A, sustainability, B, organic. So there's a big organic food movement in general in Germany. And then C, they're very open-minded and very exploratory and very innovative in their kind of thinking, and thus very open to new distilleries, and in particular new distilleries doing things in a different way. So they have always been a really, really important market for us. And I think the US, I would say I don't have enough experience yet to say, but certainly what I have seen on my 2 visits so far has been super positive. Lots of enthusiasm, lots of interest in the sustainability side, lots of very high levels of whiskey knowledge and interest in the innovation side, but also, and this is not really the case in Europe, lots of interest in a female owned and run business.
So I want to hit that on the last point as well. But I can see an angle getting into Spain in particular, only because of the use of the Rioja casks, bringing it back to where the cask came from.
That's a good idea.
Might be a limited release there, of course, a couple dozen cases maybe, or I don't know if it's even worth it to get in there at that scale, but it could be something. But yes, I wanted to ask this as well, and I think it's a good place to wrap up our conversation, which is the fact that Nc'nean is a distillery that is female run, female owned and led, and it deserves pointing out, not because that's different. I mean, it shouldn't be for that reason, but because there are so few. And we're not just talking in Scotland, I mean, worldwide, there are so few female run, let alone female owned from the beginning, distilleries. And I would love for you to share, if you don't mind, your experience as a woman, having been part of this whole journey, and how that has impacted that journey.
So, and it's right to ask about the journey, because that's definitely been a journey for me. I honestly did not think anything of it when I started. When I left Bain to start Nc'nean, I just thought I was leaving to start a business. And I thought a lot about starting my own business, partly because of this experience at the smoothie company I talked about. And it didn't strike me as odd or unusual or remarkable or anything that I should be a woman starting a business, or really a woman starting a whiskey business. And because for the first 4 years when we were raising money and then building, we had no public profile, there was no chance for anyone else to point out this was odd or unusual or remarkable either. So I honestly didn't think about it. I occasionally thought, especially when we were in site meetings during the build phase, there's like 15 men in the room and I'm the only woman, but that's also fairly usual in construction, so I didn't really think anything of it. And then it was only really in 2017, once we started distilling and we had a website and people started wondering what we were doing, that people started remarking on it. And I think my experience would be that within the whiskey industry, it's an incredibly welcoming place. There's actually lots of women working in the industry, although I completely agree with your point that there's not many women leading whiskey businesses. And that within the industry, no one either remarks on it or treats women any differently. I think the most surprise definitely comes from outside of the industry. And that could be from bartenders or that could be from consumers. And I think it reflects a broader problem that Scotch in particular has. And I don't know whether it's such a big problem in American whiskey or not, but in particular, Scotch has this image problem, I believe, which is that it's for men. And I think that is a really bad place for the industry to be. For at least the most practical point of view, they're cutting out half of their potential consumers. And more broadly, I think the next generation, just as they're really interested in sustainability and authenticity and innovation, they're also really interested in diversity and representation of a broader group of people. And I think if Scotch whisky fails to address that, it's not going to be in as good a place in 20 years' time. So I do think it's important for the future of the industry. But I also think it's important that we bring more diverse people, whether that be race diversity or gender diversity or anything else, into the industry, both as consumers and to work in it. Because diversity does what it says on the tin. It brings in this diversity of thought and experience. And I think that's only a positive thing for the industry.
I think it's a great place to end. So, Annabel, thank you so much for coming on to talk about Nc'nean Distillery, introduce us to this relatively still new distillery on the western coast of Scotland that is coming into the US. I know it's still relatively new here, but you can find it. Basically look for now at least, look for the big cities to find it. But I'm sure it'll be rolling out a little bit more as the consumer base becomes aware of it. I will look to hopefully be able to do a formal review of at least one of the products for the podcast. I have my notes from the tastings, but they're not as formal as I normally do, but I'll figure something out with that. In the meantime, you can, of course, listen to other episodes that I've referenced in interviews. There will be links to the show notes. There will be links to social media to follow up and follow what Nc'nean is doing and when they will hopefully be coming to your area. Spain, keep an eye out. Maybe we can get some Rioja casks there. In the meantime, this has been another episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Annabel, hang on with me for just a second after we finish recording, and I will see you all next week. Hey folks, thanks for listening to another episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. If you like what you hear, please go ahead and click that subscribe, follow, or like button. Leave a rating and review on your podcast app of choice, and let me know what you want to hear. You can reach out to me through the podcast apps or email me at david@whiskeymyweddingring.com with any suggestions or ideas for new show guests. You can also support the podcast at patreon.com/whiskeymyweddingring. That's whiskey with an E, for as little as $1 a month. $5 a month gets you access to bonus content, including our soon-to-resume Under the Influencer series, and $25 a month means you join the Barrel Share Club. Each month, Barrel Share Club members get to try products sent to me for review, bottles from my own collection, and sometimes bottles that I just pick up because they're fun or interesting. Right now, only 5 spots remain in the Barrel Share Club, so grab your place today. Finally, please follow on Instagram. You can follow me at Whiskey My Wedding Ring or at Whiskey Ring Podcast. You can follow me on Twitter at Whiskey Ring. You can follow on Facebook at Whiskey My Wedding Ring or join the Facebook group, the Whiskey Ringers group. And I hope to see you there. Cheers, thank you for the support, and see you next time.